Hear the word knight, you might imagine a medieval nobleman in shining armor, defending castles and maidens. But in Rome, the equites were something else. The term equite comes from equus, which means horse. And yes, they were horsemen, but they were also much more, a separate social class, a unique blend of soldier, businessman, and urban aristocrat. They weren't senators, but they weren't ordinary either. They were the second most powerful class in Rome, and sometimes even more influential than the first. Originally, the equites were the first cavalry corps of ancient Rome. Only those who could afford their own horse and equipment could serve as such. It was a privilege reserved for the wealthiest citizens, just below senatorial status. But soon, the title ceased to be merely military, and became a mark of prestige. To be considered an equite, it was not enough to have combat skills. Money was needed. A lot. The main requirement was to have a minimum fortune, usually 400,000 sesterces, a real fortune, and to maintain a life commensurate with that level. Furthermore, they were required to behave respectably and avoid engaging in activities deemed undignified, although that was subject to flexibility, especially when money was involved. In short, the equites were the non-political rich of Rome. A midpoint between military power and economic power. And even though they were no longer essential on the battlefield, they still wore the title with pride. Because being an equite wasn't just about riding a horse. Was to belong to an elite that ruled from the shadows. But how did they dress? What distinguished them from the rest? And what symbol did a true equite always wear? In a city where appearance was everything, the equites knew how to get noticed. They did not wear common togas or generic armor. The equites had exclusive symbols that showed their status with just a glance. The most famous of all, the golden ring, the annulus aureus. A simple hoop that not everyone could wear. In Rome, gold in the hand was not an ornament, it was a statement of class. And although not everyone fought on horseback anymore, the name remained. Because in its beginnings, the horse was not just for transportation, it was a state privilege. In fact, during the Republic, the Roman state paid for the horses of the most distinguished equites. In return, they expected military service and, above all, loyalty. In battle, the equites were better equipped than common infantry, light breastplates, decorated helmets, lances, short swords and oval shields. But what really set them apart wasn't their weapons, but their lifestyle. They wore the angusticlavian tunic, with thin stripes instead of the thick ones worn by senators. It was a subtle detail, but in Rome, every stripe counted. They also occupied special seats at public spectacles, courts, and ceremonies. They were not politicians, but they were in every space where power breathed. Being an equite not only opened doors. I closed them for others. Over time, the royal cavalry of the army ceased to be in the hands of the equites, but the title became more social than military. It was like membership in Rome's economic elite. A class that didn't need to govern from the Senate, because it already governed with money. And speaking of money, what did these knights do when they weren't riding or fighting? When Rome no longer needed aristocratic cavalry, the equites found something much more profitable: the business of the empire. Instead of fighting, the equites became the most influential businessmen of the Republic and the empire. They didn't make laws like the senators did, but they controlled the money that made Rome run. They were the publicani, state contractors, in charge of such minor things as collect taxes in the provinces, manage mines, routes and ports, provide grain, weapons and equipment to the army, lend money, even to the Senate itself. And why them and not the senators? Because the laws prevented senators from participating in direct business with the state. But the equites didn't have those restrictions, so they occupied all those economic spaces with intelligence and a lot of ambition. They controlled the tax collection of entire provinces, often with an iron fist. so harsh that they were hated by the local populations, who saw them as true parasites in togas. But in Rome, they were respected. And what's better, they were necessary. Many equites were also bankers, shipowners, merchants, and speculators. And although they weren't technically part of the government, their influence was felt everywhere. Some even served as judges, diplomats, and military advisors. His power was silent, but profound. While the senators were fighting in the forum, the equites were doing business with the wars. And there were those who used that wealth to make the political leap. Because yes, some equites made history. And not just from the shadows. Not all equites were content to be discreetly rich. Some were protagonists of Roman history, and used their status as a springboard to power, fame, or infamy. One of the best known was Mark Antony. Yes, the same one who shared power with Julius Caesar, confronted Octavian, and fell in love with Cleopatra. Marcus Antonius was born into the equestrian order, and although he later rose to political office, his equestrian origins marked the beginning of his career. In fact, many of Caesar's military allies were loyal equites who administered resources, troops, and provinces on his behalf. Another famous, though not as beloved, example was Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea who went down in history for ordering the crucifixion of Jesus. Pilate was not a senator, he was a knight. Like many others, he had been appointed provincial prefect because of his status and his loyalty to the emperor. And let us not forget Publius Helvius Pertinax, son of a freedman, who began as a horseman and became emperor. Although he only reigned for a few months before being assassinated. Still, his rise demonstrates that the Ordo Equester was not a stagnant class. With ambition, discipline, and loyalty, one could go far. Many equites also commanded fleets, built infrastructure, organized censuses, and even participated in imperial espionage. They were the technocrats of the empire, executors of Caesar's will without needing to be in the Senate. In short, the Ordo Equester functioned as a hinge class. They did not have the senatorial lineage, but they did have the money, the intelligence and connections to shape the destiny of Rome from all fronts. However, what goes up must also come down. And that's what happened with this enigmatic class. For centuries, the equites were the secondary economic, administrative, and military soul of Rome. But like everything in the empire, its power was not eternal. The beginning of the end began with a phenomenon that Rome was already well acquainted with, the centralization of power. As emperors gained more control, traditional social classes began to lose strength. And the Ordo Equester was no exception. Under the empire, many equites were absorbed into the bureaucratic system. Some became imperial officials, others governors, supervisors, prefects. But they no longer acted as an independent class. Now they were instruments of the emperor. Furthermore, the distinction between senators and equites became blurred. Over time, emperors began to promote equites to positions previously exclusive to the Senate, and also to demote senators to equestrian rank. The border became more political than social. Worse still, the military and fiscal reforms that came with emperors like Diocletian and Constantine ended up breaking down the old class structure. The Ordo Equester ceased to make sense as an autonomous group. They were no longer an elite on horseback, but simply another category within the imperial system. In the end, the equites didn't disappear overnight, but their role as a key class did. They were assimilated into the new imperial order, becoming cogs in a much more centralized and less aristocratic machinery. What was once a symbol of honor, wealth, and freedom? It ended up as just another title within the protocol. And so the equites, the horsemen, the businessmen, the knights of Rome. They went from galloping to the silence of history.